I'm back once again with another Total War 3 Kingdoms video, and I want to address a lot of the concerns and rumors I've been seeing about the new game. One thing I've definitely noticed is there's a lack of general knowledge about the time period, especially what warfare and tactics were like. There's also quite a bit of misinformation about what the novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms is like, and that kinda grinds my gears. That being said, I'm going to put my expertise here to use and discuss some of the fears and worries about the time period and let you know, based on my knowledge of the period in the book, which ones I think are misinformed and which ones have some merit. First, a little bit about me. The Three Kingdoms period is 100% the historical era I know the most about. I have read the novel front to back quite a few times, perused records of the Three Kingdoms probably more than a sane person really should. I've read some of Raphael D. Crispigny's other works as well, and he is pretty much the Western guru of the era. Not to mention, I've played pretty much every Dynasty Warriors game ever, so while I'm not any type of academically trained historian, over years of a very intense interest in a very specific thing, I have accumulated quite a bit of knowledge, and I am more than down to share it. So let's kick things off with one of the first big concerns that I was hearing when the game was first announced. There will be a lack of factions in the game. I'm gonna rule that one highly unlikely. So while we most likely won't see the 100 plus minor independent factions of the most recent games clogging the map and making turns take thousands of minutes, especially if you don't have the best PC, there should be no shortage of factions considering, number one, the starting time of the game. Remember that 190 was the beginning of the very violent collapse of the Han Dynasty, where numerous regional warlords begin accumulating power, and many of these warlords were formidable and menacing obstacles for the founders of the Three Kingdoms. Now I could list regional lords by the dozens, but I'll highlight the most powerful ones of the time. There was Yuan Shao and his half-brother Yuan Shu in the north and south respectively, Gongsun Zan in the northern part of the dynasty bordering Manchuria, Liu Biao, who controlled a massive amount of territory in Jing province and was considered a major threat to both Sun Quan and South Cao, Ma Teng in Xiliang to the west and later his son Ma Chao, and Liu Zhang to the southwest in the mountainous region of Yi, where Liu Bei would later found Shu Han. Of those warlords, the one that would be most likely to be a playable faction, in addition to the very obvious Wei Shu Wu and the very likely Lu Bu faction, is Yuan Shao, who is a major player in the anti-Dong Zhuo coalition and was a noteworthy enemy of Cao Cao, the founder of Wei. And those are just the major ones, but secondly, those are only the Chinese warlords. Several outside forces played roles in the wars of the period as well. So there is what is known as the 5 barbarian tribes, many of whom played major roles in the events of the period and the novel. The most notable is the Xiongnu, who were a proto-Mongolic people, and likely the same people who were later pushed westward and became known as the Huns. The Xiongnu were a semi-united people who were essentially a falling apart confederation of various tribes. The Chanyu, or simply Khan at the time, was Yu Fulo, who was a member of the coalition against Dong Zhuo. So the Xiongnu fought heavily against the states in the north bordering Mongolia, and eventually became subjugated by Cao Wei, who used the horsemen as auxiliaries in their armies. The other barbarian tribes in the north included the Wu Huan, who were another proto-Mongolic people, and they played an important role in the Battle of White Wolf Mountain. And there was also the Shan Bei, also from the northern steppes, who would eventually found their own dynasty in the next period. Then to the west, towards Tibet, were the Qiang, who played a role in the wars between Shu and Wei. Then there was the Shan Yue, who were a mountain-dwelling people in the regions occupied by Eastern Wu, and the source of numerous headaches for Sun Quan and probably also his drinking problem. Nearly every major Eastern Wu general led expeditionary forces that engaged in skirmishes large and small against the Shan Yue. Eastern Wu also invaded and occupied Vietnam for a short time before rebellions occurred and they kinda had to withdraw. They also occupied Taiwan, which was dominated primarily by Aboriginal peoples. Shu Han also possessed territories in Southeast Asia in a region known at the time as Nanzhong. The people there, referred to as Nanman, also rebelled against Shu Han and were a mix of ethnic groups including Han Chinese, Thai, Vietnamese, and others. Finally, in the northeast, Korea was going through its own Three Kingdoms period, and one of the kingdoms, Goguryeo, my pronunciation that might not be the most correct, which was the largest at the time, fought numerous battles against Han forces in Liaodong, and eventually became temporary allies with Cao Wei to crush Gongsun Yuan's rebellion around 238. Sun Quan also attempted to ally himself with them numerous times, so not only was China dealing with a very intense and fractured civil war, but was also under constant threat from outside forces, which should total, I would hope, a healthy amount of factions in the game. I wouldn't be surprised if both the Xiongnu and Nanman, two of the most well-known barbarian tribes of the era, appeared as playable factions either in the base game or as DLC. There will be a lack of unit diversity! I'm gonna call this one unlikely. I've seen many people saying there'll be a lack of uniqueness amongst the varying factions, and there are a few things I think people need to keep in mind. First and foremost, warfare is shaped as a reaction to the opponents you're facing, and as we saw prior, there was no shortage of both external and internal threats, and they varied quite extensively by regions. Don't be misled, however, in that we're going to have crazy unique armies like in Warhammer, because the standardization of armies during the Han Dynasty did also make it so that many elements of regional armies were similar. Allow me to enlighten you with some general knowledge of both large and small-scale warfare during the time. So the larger the armies were, the more uniform they were. What I mean by that is, it was more likely armies would be composed of similar units employing similar tactics. See, the vast bulk of larger armies at this time period were poorly equipped and lightly trained peasant conscripts serving primarily as infantry. The common weapons were the Chinese spear, known as the Chong, the Chinese saber, which is called the Dao, the crossbow, and two distinctly Chinese weapons, the sickle-like dagger axe, also known as a gur, and a halberd variation of it, known as the Ji, all of which were pretty cheap and easy to supply in mass and to train people to use in formation. So here's where it gets interesting. While, large portions of the armies were very much similar, smaller portions of these armies were made of elite veterans who could vary quite a bit regionally. So cavalry played a large role in the period and had grown to become a staple of later Han armies, replacing chariots for the most part because of how much more effective cavalry was at combating nomadic horsemen. So in the northern plains of China, cavalry were especially dominant and consisted of everything from light horsemen and horse archers to various forms of heavy shock cavalry and armored cataphracts. However, in the southwest, which was far more mountainous, and especially Hanzhong, which was the only major access point to the south, narrow choke points and cliffs made cavalry far less effective. So in situations like this, ranged warfare was very important, where both crossbows and composite bows were used. Make no mistake, cavalry was still used, but large-scale cavalry charges would be difficult in that kind of terrain. So instead, infantry fighting was especially dominant with pike and halberd formations, and heavier shock infantries doing most of the melee fighting. Meanwhile, the southeast was also quite different, which while being somewhat mountainous, was also dominated by thick forests and rivers. The southern lands were frequently ignored by the Han government and considered somewhat like the backwaters of the country. So bandits and river pirates were actually able to consolidate power and form standing armies and fleets at times. Many of these groups were absorbed by Eastern Wu, with quite a few notable Wu generals being former pirates, which when coupled with the natural barriers rivers like the Yangtze formed, it led to a strong tradition of naval warfare and versatile marines who could be competent on both land and water. Now, in small-scale skirmishes, frequently only the elite forces of the armies took part, and these mostly took the forms of guerrilla warfare-like tactics, things like ambushes, traps, and raids being the most common. So from the description, there's plenty of room for diversity, and that's not even covering the various tribes. The steppe-dwelling barbarians, as you can imagine, had a heavy focus on horse archery, while southern tribes like the Nanman utilized various forms of infantry in addition to war elephants. Furthermore, many of the regional lords, and later on, the Three Kingdoms themselves, had unique elite battalions whose names are in fact recorded in history. In the north, Gongsun Zan was famous for his cavalry regiment known as the White Riders. These men all rode white horses, and he used them frequently against the Shanbei and Wu Huan, because those tribesmen viewed the white horses as sacred, so they kind of had like a fair reaction to it. Cao Cao incorporated former Yellow Turban rebels who turned bandits into an elite standing army called the Qingzhou Troop. He also had what we would probably consider in the West to be knights, known as his Tiger Leopard Regiment. Shu Han General Chen Dao led an elite squadron known as the White Feathers, and Shu Han strategist Zhuge Liang is credited with revamping the Chinese repeating crossbow, known as the Zhuge Nu, or Chu Ko Nu, and employing it en masse. And this is just a handful of examples. Furthermore, if more fantastical elements of the novel are followed, we could see things such as tigers, fire-shooting siege engines, and even early landmines on the battlefield as well, but that, I will admit, is a bit pushing it in some regard. So it all depends on how creative CA is willing to be here. I would expect less like Shogun 2 and more like Medieval 2 in terms of rosters, with many factions sharing similar units, but with a good degree of regional variation and differences across the landscape. Heroes will play a major role in the game. That is highly likely. This is guaranteed. So in terms of historical figures and their exploits, the Three Kingdoms period is easily one of the most well-documented eras in Chinese history, thanks mostly due to three factors. First, it was short, which always helps contain things. Second, each of the Three Kingdoms were big fans of record keeping, and the records they kept were all compiled towards the end of the era during the Jin Dynasty by Chen Shou in Records of the Three Kingdoms. I've seen people saying that historical records were only written hundreds of years later. That is 100% not true. And third, the Han Dynasty also had a strong tradition of scholarship and historical record keeping itself, which did not collapse alongside the central government. But anyway, the point of me telling you all that is we know the names, and even sometimes style names, of some 700-something generals, warlords, and officials during the Three Kingdoms period because of this, and many of their exploits, and even lack of them sometimes, are well detailed. Now I can go on and on all day about people like Zhang Liao, Gan Ning, and Wei Yan, but what you really care about is how the fantastical elements of Romance of the Three Kingdoms would translate into hero gameplay. First, let me address a big misconception people seem to have about figures in the novel. I know the majority of people slinging this around are the same people who freely admit they've never read the novel and know very little about the period, so no skin off my bones, but let's start. The novel is not full of generals defeating entire armies by themselves. You are getting that from other adaptations of the source material, most likely Dynasty Warriors. I can only really think of two examples in the novel where characters fend off large scores of soldiers by themselves, not necessarily even armies. Zhao Yun at Changban and Dian Wei at Wancheng. Other than that, what you'll mostly find is much less these historical figures wasting time on common mooks, and more often spending time fighting each other. The novel has a heavy focus on duels between heroic figures, things like Lu Bu versus the Three Sworn Brothers, or Ma Chao dueling Zhu Chu at Tong Gate. Now, dueling on the battlefield did not happen nearly as much as the novel portrays it, but it has always been a long-standing element in East Asian literature, probably because dueling was prevalent during the era Romance of the Three Kingdoms was set in, and also when it was written amongst citizens, and was probably something audiences would be very familiar with. Now, there is some truth to these stories of heroic figures killing perhaps dozens of men, especially backed by their own people, instead of hundreds or thousands. Recall earlier where I pointed out the great imbalance between the peasant conscripts and veterans in armies, and make note of the large skill gap that comes with it. Officers of the time would certainly be better trained and outfitted than the majority of the enemies they'd encounter, though they most of the time were not super quick to rush into battle either, unless you were a madman like Yue Jin, but that's another story. So there are a few recorded instances of some famous officers killing more than a handful of men, which might be slightly embellished, I will admit, but I figured it could help explain where this idea came from in the first place. We'll use the Battle of Zhaoyao Ford as an example. Zhang Liao, according to Records of the Three Kingdoms, broke out of an enemy encirclement, only to pretty much break back into said encirclement by himself to rescue his remaining men who were trapped. Later on, same battle, Ling Tong, a general of Sun Quan, fought nearly to the death and is reported to have pretty much single-handedly slew dozens of soldiers covering Sun Quan's retreat. Apparently, Ling Tong was so wounded by the end of this, it was considered almost like a divine miracle that he even survived. So it's no doubt highly likely that because all of these figures are well documented and also well known, that we'll see a strong focus on heroes and generals, probably more so than we ever had in a previous Total War game before. Heroes will be overpowered units like in Warhammer. That I am actually thinking is a mixed bag. So this one I'm iffy on. The later cultural legacy of the novel and its adaptations into film and video games has shifted modern portrayals in this direction. Once again, Dynasty Warriors and the Chinese wuxia films, as well as anime adaptations all spring to mind. So there is an accumulated pop cultural legacy surrounding the era within the media based around it, more so than anything we really have in the West. I guess a good comparison would be with the embellishment of the Spartans in ancient Greece in movies like 300 and giving their names to various other things throughout media and culture, like Spartans in Halo, and Spartan races, and so forth. Of course, there is a certain charm to seeing Lu Bu, who is a part of pop culture is known as a killing machine, maiming mooks left and right. CA can't exactly ignore that. It's like portraying Julius Caesar and not giving him the laurels, or not making Napoleon short. It's not technically incorrect, it's just not what we're used to. Also, considering how successful of a mechanic legendary lords were in Warhammer, it would make sense for CA to want to bring some of those elements over into their next game. At the same time though, I'm sure they realized that making overpowered heroes in abundance would certainly cause them to lose face with their fans of historical settings. As far as Immortal Heroes, I think that is also unlikely except for maybe your faction leader, because then things like succession get a little complicated. Deaths of these historical figures are important in both the history and novel, and they fall in battle or are captured and executed quite frequently. But what fun would it be to have the legendary Guan Yu in your army, only for him to fall to a block of spare militia in a few seconds because he's technically a cavalry unit? At the same time, it'd be very out of place for a Total War game especially to watch Guan Yu slaughter 3 whole regiments and walk away at only half health. There's a very fine line that needs to be walked here. Magic will appear in the game. This one is possible, but unlikely. Now obviously there was no magic at work in history save for the magic of superstition, but magic does appear in the novel and in various folk stories about the period. There are a few things to keep in mind with this magic though. First of all, don't think you'll be raining fireballs and conjuring lightning like in Warhammer. Magic in the novel, during battle especially, was much more subtle, and honestly very infrequent. Examples include the conjuring of a dust storm to make paper soldiers look like a real army during the Yellow Turban Rebellion, or Zhuge Liang praying for the wind to change direction at the Battle of Chirbi, or the same Zhuge conjuring a cloud of fog to give pursuing Wu general, Lu Xun, a headache of a time navigating a maze of stone statues. Other than that, events like the flooding of castles and destructive fire attacks and deadly landslides were portrayed much more realistically as the works of tactical geniuses, whether they were really in reality just that, or just unfortunately timed natural disasters. Magic does also appear in politics and the personal lives of some characters as well. For instance, a Taoist executed by Sun Tzu, Sun Quan's older brother, curses him to die shortly after, and is given as one of the reasons for his assassination. Zhuo Si, a Taoist mystic who tried to convince Cao Cao to convert, utilized various forms of shape-shifting and illusions. Zhuge Liang also attempts a Taoist ritual to extend his life by 5 years, which gets interrupted and is attributed to be the cause of his death. I'm sure you're noticing a pattern here, which is Taoism's association with magic. The Han Dynasty saw a sharp rise in Taoism, and it was one of the principles behind the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which kicks off its collapse. Taoism was initially at odds with traditional Confucianism as well as local religions, which led it to being attributed magic powers and somewhat vilified during the time period in later generations. This was adapted into the novel. So there are instances of magic, though they are not necessarily the most extreme examples save for something like Zhuo Si. For instance, knowledge of regional weather patterns has also been used as a sufficient and more reality-rooted explanation of Zhuge Liang, knowing how the wind would change direction during the Battle of Chirbi. But at the same time, CA likely knows that many fans of their historical games wouldn't be too keen on the overt appearance of magic in the game. So I think it's unlikely any magic will appear. But if it did appear in some shape or form, I would expect mostly isolated incidences and scripted events during the campaign, or maybe passing mentions in general speeches and stuff like that, and next to nothing on the battlefield. The game will follow the events of Romance of the Three Kingdoms rather than actual history. I'm gonna say this is pretty likely. This is almost a certainty considering the trailer. First of all, Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhong Fei did not join the anti-Dong Zhuo coalition in actual history. Thus, they were not present to duel Lu Bu. There was also no battle of Hu Lao or Sichuan Pass, which is the battle you see in the trailer. The closest thing was Sun Jian, the father of Sun Quan, pretty much kicking Lu Bu and Hua Xiong's ass a couple of times. The oath at the Peach Garden also didn't happen. Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhong Fei did apparently treat each other as close as brothers though, so it's not entirely out of the question that they maybe swore an oath. So pretty much the only historically accurate thing in the trailer is Cao Cao and who I think is Sun Jian being in a war room, and Lu Bu being there. Dong Zhuo was well on his way to heading towards Chang'an after burning down Luoyang, so he probably wouldn't have been present either. Don't let that dismay you though, because now you think that the novel is a whole bunch of made up events. Well, for the most part, no. The overall chain of events in the novel is pretty accurate. The vast majority of battles in the novel did indeed happen, and the novel sticks to the truth for the most part, especially when it matters. Many of the political events did also happen, though they might be exaggerated somewhat here and there. So the majority of changes from history in the novel are pretty small in scale when you really think about it, and it really wouldn't affect gameplay that much. Many characters have the cause of their deaths altered to be more dramatic, with many who died of old age or illness falling in battle instead. There is no instance off the top of my head of characters living much longer than they actually did, but don't quote me on that. Other fictional elements include characters who did not technically exist, such as named Yellow Turban rebels like Cheng Yuanji. Was there definitely Yellow Turban captains? Yes, absolutely. Was one named Cheng Yuanji? Well, we have no records of that, so maybe not. Other fictional characters a bit more notable include some of Guan Yu's children, who at the end of the day are really small potatoes in the much bigger stew. Obviously, aside from a few recorded conversations, most of the novel's conversations are made up. But again, that would have very little impact on gameplay. Thus, some characterizations and personalities are definitely off, such as Cao Cao being a sinister villain and Liu Bei being a paragon of virtue, both of which are definitely a bit more give and take. There has been a push lately among more recent media to portray Cao Cao in particular in a more historically accurate light, with the acclaimed Cao Cao series in China, and even the recent Dynasty Warriors games have followed this trend, so it wouldn't be surprising if CA followed it too. Worst comes to worst, these things manifest as some traits for generals on the campaign map. A key thing to remember, and it's an important distinction, is that Romance of the Three Kingdoms is historical fiction, not a fantasy novel. While it has fantastical elements, it does tell and stick to historical events that did happen, featuring characters that did exist, doing things they mostly really did. And at the end of the day, can we really know for a fact what Lu Su said to Zhou Yu one night in Jianye if it was never written down? So as you can see, with me being a big fan of the period and novel, there's definitely a lot I'm looking to see in this game. So I'm planning on covering news of it from time to time. I plan on making a video before they actually announce actual mechanics that's sort of like a wish list, what I'm really hoping to see in the game. Especially when it comes to mechanics and features and modes and content and stuff like that. So stay tuned for that eventually. In the meantime, I hope this video was a good resource for you. If you're interested in learning where you can find out more about the time period, I made a video about that as well, and there's also an excellent post about the same subject on the Total War Reddit that I'll link in the description. I also plan on reviewing Dynasty Warriors 9 when it comes out as well, so if that's something you're interested in, feel free to come back then. If you like Dynasty Warriors, I'm also part of a project making an abridged show of Dynasty Warriors 8, which you can check out if you're interested.
I forgot about Lu Bu again. Miss me? You're not getting away this time. Cao Cao. Lu Bu, the people's champ, Yan Wei, is here to lay the smackdown on your candy ass.
Holy shit! Dwayne Johnson!
I believe he said it was Deanne Way.
It starts out a bit rough, but I think it grows exponentially better the more it goes. Worst comes to worst, it gives you a good idea of the events of the Three Kingdoms, I would hope, since we have been doing our best to kind of combine historical interpretation as well as the game's interpretation and even parts of the novel all together. Lastly, one thing I just wanted to point out from the trailer is it seems like Seiya won't be going with the common faction colors of blue for Cao Cao and green for Liu Bei. Judging by the banners and tassels on armor, it seems like Liu Bei will be using yellow with dark green accents, while Cao Cao will use red with purple accents. The character I think is Sun Jian, wears the red headscarf he reportedly did wear, but I can't tell if the Sun family will use red altogether because we really haven't seen them. It looks like Lu Bu's men will be using a red color with maybe black accents? I think this is all okay, and they probably are doing it to differentiate themselves from Koei, which is fine. But I'm sure one of the first mods for this game is gonna be changing factions to the more recognizable Koei color scheme, so modders, we're counting on you, fam.